All good. Brilliant. Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. Nice having beer and pizza with you over the last hour. Welcome to EdinburghJS April. Tonight we've got two speakers. Unfortunately, Tandy had to pull out, so Alan is going to be doing a talk later on Rails and JavaScript, which should be interesting. But before then, we have got Michael Hayes, who's come over from Glasgow. Many of you will be familiar with Michael from Rookie Oven and other meetups that he's run over the past decade and a half in Glasgow. I've known Michael for a long time, and AdJam is his agency, and he's going to be talking to us tonight about React Native and the AdJam way of doing that. So I will hand over to him to hear more about that. Cheers.
Yeah, so about me, as some social media stuff, Twitter, whatever, GitHub, LinkedIn. So yeah, I've been doing AdJam since 2014, doing predominantly Rails and React Native development. Kind of working in main areas of healthcare, mobility, and education. So things like apps for EV charge networks. We made an app with Alzheimer's Scotland. And when we do these mobile projects, we use React Native. So we started AdJam in 2014 with doing native development, so Objective-C in Java. And then in 2016, we made our first React Native app. It was I don't know if anybody remembers 2048, the swipe, build up the numbers. We made a clone of that, as everyone did at the time, but we decided to use React Native as a wee trial, so that was in 2016. And then since then, every app we've done, mobile app has been using React Native. So I think that was like React Native version 16 or something like that. We're up at 64, I think now. So disclaimer, this is all just personal preference for myself. Like this is the team at AdJam. By no means am I arrogant enough to say that this is the way you should be doing it. I'd encourage you to challenge what I say and what I've got slides for here. Make your own choices. But this is the advice that I would give. This is what we do daily, and this is what we've been doing since 2016 in React Native land. And disclaimer too, although this is predominantly React Native I'm talking about here, this also applies React projects in the web. Like we do quite a lot of React web stuff using Next.js. So yeah, you can adapt the learners from this to the web, or any other frameworks or even languages. It's just like it's going to come across as teaching Granny to suck eggs, because it's like some of the basics of good software, but I'll get to how it applies to specifically React Native as we go through it. So common problems that I see in React projects that aren't AdJams. Business logic muddled in with display. So components that are like 900 lines long, making API calls, just storing the responses in a set state, use state. It's not broken out, and it's just a bit of a muddle. That then leads on to no approach to state management. So something like Redux or MobX, React Query, something. Inconsistent approach to project structure. This is one that really grinds my gears. Like some places you'll see, you'll have a utilities folder. You might have a utils folder, something else, and it's all just the same stuff all spread about the code. Makes it really difficult to maintain. That inconsistency across styling, like naming, syntax, approaches to how you handle things, like that makes the code like really difficult to maintain going forward. So really bugbear of mine. Hard-coded values, magic numbers, like stuff throughout the code that really you should just extract into a config file. No testing. I wouldn't say I'm not like a diehard in making sure that we have 100% test coverage, but have tests where they're useful. Had tests where they're going to add value and save you time going forward. I'll show some examples of that. Over reliance on dependencies, like I bet everyone in the room and on YouTube who's done anything in JavaScript will attest to this, that dependencies might go stale, and when they do, it's a real pain. So don't depend on them too much. The huge components, yeah. Another part of that is not just the business logic modeled in with it, it's just repetition. this kind of like dovetails into what we're hearing in the second talk tonight, but don't repeat yourself, keep your components dry. If you're doing stuff over and over again, just break it out into its own component and then use it. And then not using any dev tools. It's staggering projects that I've seen where people have managed to get them along as far as they have just by using the Chrome debugger. Like, set up some tools that'll make your life so much easier. So I'm going to talk about what works for us with the most garish green I could pick as a slide colour. So what we do is convention over configuration. So that's a mantra that's very popular in the Rails community. Just by having like a ad-jam way of doing things means that when we approach projects and work on them as a team, we're instantly comfortable and get up to speed very quickly. If one of my colleagues drops out of the project for whatever reason, takes a holiday, I can pick it up, no bother, because we've got these kind of rules that we follow in our approach to React Native. So first thing we do is we have an opinionated folder structure. You open the project and you feel at home. We have our layout with the components, the screens, navigation, how we handle that, naming conventions. It's all standard across projects that we do. And I'll show you how we actually apply that a wee bit later on. Have an approach to API interaction and state management, and again, extract that from your components. So, and I don't want to be specific on how you should do that, like structure your project how you want it. But we always have like a file that, or a directory which we have as an API client where we'll put in functions that we'll use to call the API that is out the way and it's separated from, it's not just buried inside a component. And then again, tied to that, use something for state management. So we've used all the things on that screen. At the moment, our go-to is React Query, but use something. Don't care what it is, but I would advise using it. Sometimes it would make sense to use multiple things. So, case of React Query, very good for caching like responses from the server. But what happens if you want to keep some local state and store it locally? You need to use something else. Not being prescriptive on that. Use something, use multiple things when it makes sense to do so. Go easy on the dependencies, as I said. This is like a common thing, I guess, in people that are new to JavaScript, that you'll find something on GitHub and it looks great, solves all your problems, whack it in, npm install, and then 6 months later, somebody asks to do something, or you want to change something, or there's a bug, you go to the repo, and it's not been updated in the last 6 months. That's happened a lot to me, so that's a thing that we get as experience as you do JavaScript projects is, if there's a dependency that you could easily do yourself, then just do it yourself. Like, don't go mad on making your dependencies huge. Have tests and leverage dev tools. So I've listed out Flipper, Detox, Storybook, and Jest. This is what we use at AdJam for our React Native projects. Tests should be obvious, that if you have something that you can test, it makes it repeatable, and then if you change something, you know where you're broken at and you can fix it. It stops bugs getting in production, yada, yada, yada. Like, it's something that you should adopt in your projects. But leveraging dev tools, when you fire up a React Native project, Flipper is quite easy to get up and running. There's a lot of plugins that you can use, monitor network requests, all sorts of stuff. I would get that running, use it. Detox is a testing framework. I think it's Wix that do that. It allows you to do click-through tests. So you just fire it up and your app will click through. I find that very useful for doing like onboarding journeys on mobile apps. Storybook, that's something that is used across JavaScript frameworks, where you can create a storybook where you can click through and see your components. I can show you that later on, and Jest is widely used as well. Make your components small and dry. So as I said, like a component where you've got 900 lines of code is going to be an absolute nightmare to maintain. If you find yourself doing the same thing again and again and again, you get a big if statement, and based on all the conditions, you're rendering out basically the same bit of display, extract it into its own functional component. It takes a small amount of time, makes the code much more readable. It's just like, it's such an easy thing to do, and I see a lot of projects all the time that they don't. They just double down on repeating. I don't know if it's easy just to do, copy paste, but just extract it. Use ESLint, Prettier, whatever you want to do. Like, if you're setting up these tools, actually use them. I've looked at so many React projects, React Native, that they're using ESLint, and then there's just ignore to the point of, well, what's the point? So if you're using it, use it. If you're not using it, that's fine. I'm not going to mandate people use these things, but if you are going to use it properly. And something we do at AdJam is we use pull requests. So a human looking at your code and just asking the questions, or making sure that you're doing things the AdJam way, in our case, is so useful. Having a critical eye on what you're doing, or a helpful discussive eye, really does make your code easier to maintain. And that's something that's part of our process with our React Native projects. So that's kind of like a high level of the bad and what good looks like. But how does that actually apply to what we do at AdJam? So for us, we've got an internal tool that we've called AJ, very creative, AdJam, AJ. But we use that to a generator to generate projects, generate components. It's kind of like if anyone has used Rails, you can use Rails to generate models, controllers. We've got AJ for our React Native projects. So I created a project for EdinburghJS. I don't know if it's legible, but creates a project, puts in a whole lot of stuff that we want to get going. Sets up detox, install any dependencies that we're using, set up some font files, install CocoaPods. We've got in all our projects, we have a Docusaurus website for documentation, puts that in, initialize the Git repo, makes the first commit. It's just an opinionated way for us to get out the box a React project, which I can show you. So this is the project that I generated for tonight's talk. In the process of moving to TypeScript, which is what the red line is, but work in progress. But yeah, I'm happy to talk through this. If there's anything that anyone would particularly like to see, give me a shout and I can go there. But yeah, we've got our folder structure within the app directory. We've got API, assets, components, config, navigation, schemas, which is used for React hook form, screens, which is I think in a React web project we call that pages. It's the elements that we're navigating to, types for our TypeScript, and a utils folder where we'll put some business logic in there as well. So if nobody wants anything in particular, I'll just jump in to components. So we always set up with a common folder in here. Within there, we'll have components which are common across the project. So things like a button, we've got that open. So our button takes these props. It's an opinionated button that you do a project so many times, and lo and behold, you need buttons that people are going to click. So we've kind of like distilled this into like a common button that we use across projects. If we wanted something custom, we don't have to use it, we can delete it. Our convention typically is that we'll use the initials of the project. So if it was EdinburghJS, it'd be AJ button. But here, this is an AdJam generated project, so we've just kept with the AJ prefix for them. So the button, it follows a lot of the conventions that I spoke about there. So, it's quite a lot of props and ways that we can style it. I'll get on to showing you that as well. But it's not the biggest file. It's like, 137 lines. So keeping it concise. We also use a common text component. So this is something I've seen people do like many different ways. I guess this is kind of like a style components approach to it for React Native, but we have a text component. You get the text component from React Native. We use that, and then we wrap around some of our styling and approaches to it. So things like setting fonts, font weights, colors, whatever we can. Then we have props, so we just, when we want to use it, so it's actually used within the button, I believe it should be. Yeah, the text. So if I wanted the text there to be bold, I would just add the bold prop, and then that would style it. I've seen other people approach this with like a global style, so they treat it kind of like CSS within React Native, but then they also do the style sheet object at the bottom, and then sometimes do inline styles. This is what I mean by having a consistent approach to it. Like we have our AG text component, we're consistent with it. And it works for us. If we work on a project, somebody comes along and says, right, actually we want to change the font style to something else. Well, we change it one place and it updates across the app. So yeah, that's the components. We then would have directories that would be for like the specific namespace of a screen or a concept within the app. So we might have like a forms directory, or like in that example there, it's a settings directory because there's a settings page within the app. If there's no suggestions of where to go to next, I'll just pop into navigation. So we use React Navigation on the project. Probably the starting point of that is we've got this auth switch, which based on some logic will take people to different places, and that's where we've got our storybook set up. And then we'll have this auth stack, which is the next place I'll go to, which we have our screens for outside authentication, so a welcome screen, login screen, sign up screen, a password reset screen. So I'll open the emulator. So this is the app generated, ran AJ React Native new EdinburghJS, and this is the app it popped out for us. So we're kind of like, I don't think this is necessarily a good design for an app to take that into account, but we've put in different elements that are common across projects. So we've got like an image, logos, the buttons, the different styles, the navigation stuff. So we've got like a checkbox component, the inputs, we've got that so we can have it with like the password type, a right accessory for showing it. These are just common elements that you would find in projects. Modal, terms and conditions. Forgot password. So yeah, that's all just like generated out the box for us. Our intent isn't that this is how all our apps will look. It's just this can help you if you want it, and this is like the foundation of the styling of how you should approach the app as an AdJam app. I guess the next thing that would be useful for me to show would be, so we have a config setup as well where we have different environments set here, and we can set, it's just an object that we can set some values in it that for that environment we might want a particular thing. The local file should be in the get ignore. It's not because it's in the process of getting changed to TypeScript. But if we have that the local in the get ignore, then you can, across the team, we can have our own local configs that don't touch each other's. So it works quite well for us. And then in the config index, we just import them in order of how we want them to be. So also I've mapped my command R to something else, so I can't refresh. So we're using storybook, as I said. So this is the activity spinner, which isn't spinning for some reason. You've got each of the components that we have in that common directory are here. For each one, we just create stories with the different, some different props set. So this is a button with a label, button with a loading spinner, button that's been disabled. Yeah, it's really useful for us to have storybook as a way that becomes like kind of self-documenting collection of components. Because if someone comes new onto the project, they can just fire up storybook, click through it, and see what components they have. So when they build out new components, they know they can build on what's already there. Yeah, so yeah, got our inputs. So yeah, is there anything else that anyone would particularly like to see in the generated project?
What did you use to generate the project?
AJ.
What is it? How did you generate AJ?
That's our secret sauce.
Even open source it, right?
I think I'd love to open source it, but I think open source is like I then have to maintain it for people, and we just maintain it for us, which is a lot easier. But I guess the intent of this isn't to show off AJ as a thing. It's more so the principles of what we use in a project that's generated through AJ. So AJ is kind of irrelevant to it. You know, that's what I'm showing. But it's all right. Any other questions or things that people would like to see? If
So if that's coming, if also this is also focused on the React Native side, then like, is AJ doing anything in the background for you in terms of generating like, a scaffold for like an API for the app to talk to?
yeah, so that again, this is more into AdJam's internal tooling and processes, but the AJ, we have it as well. Predominantly we use Ruby on Rails in the back end, so we have AJ Rails new project name, and it spits out a project that if I did that, generated the project, ran the project, and then got in here set my API client to point to my local host. We'd have auth, we'd have sort of basically user account concept. So we have that as a like bit of internal tooling, but that's not JavaScript. So yeah, I mean, happy to show like other parts of it. So like React navigation. This was generating an app with tabs. As I said, the tabs map to like a sentence stack. I mean, we have in the components directory, we would have a directory which is related to that stack and navigation. We've found this is like a really nice way for us to just to work. We've got an API client. This is what we've got is we've got some hooks that we've written that go in there as well. Yeah, assets directory, fonts set up. We use React native vector icons, so we have like font awesome in it from the start. Yeah. So AdJam are hiring. If anyone thinks this is a nice way of doing a React Native app and would like to do it with us, then get in touch. Otherwise, if anyone's got any questions, don't feel like you have to ask now. And if there's people on YouTube, they can come and ask me via email or give me a tweet or whatever.
Does anybody have any questions for Michael?
I have a question. So, to lead into my topic, you're still using, Rails, you're still using Ruby. You're not going in a direction where you're using JavaScript, everything front and back end. How come?
So for us, I think the JavaScript, that thing about the dependencies going stale is like, I think, exemplified, is even worse when it comes to the back-end frameworks and when we come to doing stuff in the back end. I think Rails has, as a community, a long-standing. I think Rails has been on the go for like 20 years now. It's used by like huge companies. It's not going to disappear. It's performing. It's got good features. It's got a good community. If we write a project in Rails, it's going to exist, and we'll come back to it in 6 years' time. We'll be able to get it running. If it's a JavaScript project, I don't think the community's as cohesive. Not as well, generally speaking. There's not a framework. I know there's is it EdinburghJS, which looks like the most interesting JavaScript backend framework that I've seen. And going back to that thing of convention over configuration, I've not seen a JavaScript backend framework or approach that is as convention driven as Rails. So if Adjam, as a team, as we grow, that we take on new team members who are, if they're comfortable with Rails, they can get up to speed with it. On the front end, I don't think that matters quite as much, and the benefits that we get from React Native being cross-platform far outweigh doing it in Swift or Kotlin or whatever. So I think it's tools for the job, that what we want the back end to be, something that's quite stable, something that could potentially be long-lasting, and then the front end is by nature of like mobile projects with iOS and Android having annual updates, you'd probably want that to be a bit faster moving anyway. But yeah, that's our thinking. We have thought about doing JavaScript stuff on the back end as a, and if we did TypeScript, the types would be the same on the front end and the back end. You'd have that consistency throughout. But I think the benefits of the softer parts of the community stuff that you get with Rails is what keeps us there at the moment. That's too controversial for EdinburghJS.
Well, it's a brave man who's JavaScript. Anybody else have any questions?
I mean, it looks quite impressive with the scaffolding and that you've built around it. I suppose, generalistically, if you were to build another React native app, is there other sort of more generalistic open source boilerplate that you could use if you wasn't doing it yourself? Because that looks like, to build that, looks like quite a big cliff.
Yeah, I mean, so as an introduction to React Native, you can use Expo as a start, which will hold your hand, I guess, through the native parts of React Native. So it kind of abstracts away Xcode and Android Studio, which, to be honest, are usually the biggest bugbears of mine, but that's where a lot of my time gets spent. But Expo's got its own issues that you'll inevitably want to eject it from Expo. There are other frameworks and things like Native Base, which is a collection of UI components that you just wrap your app in a provider, and then you can import and use like a ton of components. I'm pretty sure there's a Material UI as well. I know Material UI on React for the web. There's an equivalent for React Native. So there are these frameworks. But I would go back to the point of like not being too reliant on dependencies, because if they go stale and you're reliant on it, or in the case of Native Base, as I understand it, they just had a big version bump from 2 to 3, so 2 is not going to be maintained anymore. If you're stuck on 2, you've got a headache of getting back up to 3, and there's been fundamental changes to how the components work, how the theming works. So, I'm not saying don't do that, but if you are doing it, it might bite you.
So I've got a question.
Yeah.
When you're revisiting projects after 6 months or a year, do you go through a phase where you do update the various dependencies that you're using and get onto the more latest versions of the framework? Or do you think, well, it's working, with these libraries as they are pinned, and you don't want to open that can of worms. I mean, what's the kind of balance that you have with essentially maintenance of projects across the life cycle?
Yeah, that it depends, I guess. It depends on the project, the scale of the project. Have they paid me to support the project as well? Am I doing them a favour? I think the first thing that I would try and, so with React Native, you've got you've got two things that that you'll be chasing, I guess, if you do want to update. You've got React as a framework, then you've got React Native as a framework, and if you're wanting to keep them up to date, which will be important for things like if when Apple brought out the notch, your app had to change to support the notch, so that would involve an upgrade to React Native. If you're doing that, there's a chance then that your dependencies will break. So even if you have it pinned, you're not going to. It won't work with the new versions. So you can get into a bit of a difficult situation where it could take 2 or 3 days to get an update done, an upgrade. When we do generate a project, we generate it with latest at that time versions of React and React Native, and from there we try and, as a team, pick and choose the dependencies that look like they'll have a longevity. But recently I had a project where we had Sentry in it, and it was the Sentry dependency was actually causing a crash on Android, which was frustrating because I wasn't getting crash reports for it because it was Sentry that was causing it. So in that case, that was the dependency. It was a project that we hadn't touched in 2 or 3 years, and Android 11 had changed something and it was causing a crash. So we had to do an upgrade on a package that ordinarily we wouldn't. If Sentry's working, why would I change it? Other than that, I would have to. So yeah, I don't know if that's a very useful answer because it all really depends. I'm waffling.
Yeah, I mean, it's useful because I guess like a lot of these things, you find you can get a technical tutorial, but actually just hearing people talk about, it's a headache. This is the things that we think about when we're choosing to do it, are quite interesting. And I think anyone who's had to maintain software over a while eventually runs into these problems. Well, do you invest time in upgrading stuff and keeping it latest, and how long do you leave it between things? Sometimes it's a bit better to be proactive, I guess.
Yeah, again, it depends on the project and the nature you're working on it. Like, AdJam as a business, we don't typically charge support. We don't do support as a thing. Like, a lot of the people we work with, the idea is that the project comes to an end, moves into business as usual, unless something happens. Typically it's an external factor like OS upgrade. In theory, that project should be fine. So we'd rather see our clients do that, and then if they want changes or if they have suggestions, or they pay for it as they need it, rather than a recurring. Not to say that we don't do that, but our typical preference is that we have a relationship where people come back to us and it's an ongoing thing. So with that, that's probably the makeup of how we as a company approach these things. Means that sometimes it would be a project that's 18 months old that we're coming to, and it's got 18 months worth of a jump, rather than continue.
Do you think that it's interesting? I think this is an interesting point. Do you think there's a difference between doing web development where browsers are built so that they still support the properties and things that they were built into them 20 years ago? It's like a non-breaking system. They add to web tags and HTML tags and CSS, whereas obviously with Android and iPhone, they make breaking changes to the UI, and that causes issues around dependencies and change control.
Interesting point, because probably the most problems I've had with changes have actually been through a browser recently, like Safari on iOS. The changes to the status bar and the adaptive height has broken some of the web apps that we've had running that were fine for ages. But yeah, I think with mobile apps, especially Android, I would say, I think like Android as a operating system was fairly open, and you could do quite a lot of stuff with it. And then as you know, Android's matured, it's got more and more locked down. They've added in permissions. They've added in a permission system that is at runtime. They've made these changes that make it difficult to make changes to your app without having to like keep it up to date with the latest platform changes. But then they're quite lax with how they do that as well. So it's Android's the one that would be given as the problems with as the platforms matured. The need to change your approaches to things increased, whereas iOS has got a little bit more of the stability they're talking about through a browser. Typically, Apple, when they're like deprecating things, it's quite clear, and the approaches haven't, like the approach to how you handle permissions hasn't changed since, you know, iOS 2 or iPhone OS 2, whereas in Android it feels like it changes every year. It feels a bit like a constantly moving target that you're chasing. Yeah.
Any more questions?
So just wondering where Xcode and Android Studio comes into play, because back in the day, everything had to be like authored in Xcode. So have they relaxed those rules now, and like, do you still use Xcode, for example?
Yeah, still use Xcode. So one of the things with React Native is you can still interact with underlying iOS app. So if you wanted to do something that like a CarPlay or a Watch app or a Share extension, you would have to do that through Xcode. And Storybook and the tools that are there. How often I would have to do that is probably less than 5% of the time. Like 95% of the time when you're doing a React Native app, probably more than that, in all honesty. You're just in your editor. You're not in Xcode or Android Studio. Where you would touch them would be for setting some assets and names, and when you do changes to things like on iOS, it's your info p list. On Android, it's your manifest or your Gradle files. You would be changing some like config values there, like version numbers and stuff, if you're not using Fastlane. And then you might use them to build your app. Oh yeah, one of the cool things that we've actually got in AJ as well is it auto-generates CIs for us, so it sets up. We use Bitrise, which is a CI platform, and we use Fastlane, which is a tool that is invaluable for managing signing keys and stuff like that. So that if there was anything to take away about interacting with the native platforms, it would be use Fastlane, which incidentally I didn't have a slide about that. I should have done. Fastlane is like really, really useful for taking away a lot of the headaches around keys. You can actually even automate it to take screenshots of your app, publishing it to the store. Any interaction with App Store Connect. On Android, there's less usage, but it's still got a few tools that are quite useful. So yeah, Android Studio and Xcode, you do need to use them, but I wouldn't be scared of them because you don't actually use them an awful lot unless you're doing something low level.
Cool. Thank you very much, Michael, for your talk. We're just going to take a quick 3-minute break to switch over laptops for Alan to get ready. So if you want to grab the last slice of pizza, refresh your drink, or take a loo break, then please do that, and we will resume in about 3 minutes. So.
All right, well, welcome back. Our next speaker is me, Alan Lloyd. So I'm going to get my excuses in early. I prepped this pretty late in the day. I did time myself, and it wasn't 15 minutes as I promised Jamie. It was about 25 minutes, but I'll see if I can rattle through. What is our time? How do we feel? Get on with it, right, okay. Yeah, you probably know me from doing kind of live streaming and events and stuff. So I run a company called Product Forge. We used to run hackathons pre-pandemic. I don't know, we'll go back to that. We might at some point. But yeah, we go out and live stream a lot of events and do a lot of videography and so on. But my background's actually in web development. So that's what I did when I left school. For most of my career, I've kind of worked with Ruby and Ruby on Rails. So that's my Twitter handle there and the company Twitter handle, if you like. I don't have the same skills with use of color in my slides, so I'm afraid this is very black and white. So first of all, well, a couple of things you're going to be thinking to yourself, potentially, we're at a JavaScript meetup, so why are you talking about Ruby on Rails? So I'll get to that in a second. If you don't know what Ruby on Rails is, first of all, and actually just a show of hands, who does know what Ruby on Rails is? Okay, well, that's good. Who's worked with Ruby on Rails before? Okay, that's cool. That's kind of what I expected. So. If you're coming at this sort of standing start, so Ruby's a scripting language. It's often kind of talked about in the same breath as Perl, Python, and PHP. They decided to use a different letter. That was its key first innovation. Ruby on Rails. So Rails is a web framework. And so there's a couple of things in that. One is it's a set of libraries to enable you to write web apps and interface with the web and HTTP and all the rest of it. But the word framework actually is kind of interesting in the context of Ruby on Rails because we didn't really talk about web frameworks generally until Ruby on Rails came along. At least most people didn't. So it's not just a set of libraries to help you build a web app. It's also a way of laying out your application, a directory structure, best practice, and a whole bunch of other stuff that came along at the same time. So it was originally extracted from a SaaS product called Basecamp. You've maybe heard of Basecamp, either the app or the company. The company's also got an email platform called Hey, so hey.com. That's also on Ruby on Rails. But so Rails was extracted out from that project. It was probably one of the first frameworks that really popularized MVC, so that stands for Model View Controller, which was a concept that existed for decades in the context of desktop applications. But it was the first time it had really been applied to kind of web frameworks in a really kind of accessible way. Now, I need to give acknowledgement to there was a framework in Java called Spring, which was a MVC framework for the web. So there's a few things in terms of Rails, which I'll get to, that there's kind of nothing new in Rails, but it was the way it packaged everything up, gave you a bunch of configurations and best practices that meant that a lot of the stuff that was previously really difficult to do became very, very accessible for a lot of people. So a lot of frameworks that came out, just shortly afterwards were very much kind of inspired by Rails. So Django, you potentially heard of for Python, Cake PHP, which I think is still going in a reasonably big way for PHP. So kind of one of the things with Rails, it contrasted itself to the sort of enterprisey Java frameworks like Spring, in the sense that you could run a simple command on the command line, kind of similar to what kind of Michael was showing earlier, and you would just get a bunch of stuff already ready-made for you. You didn't have to go into configuration files to get everything kind of up and running. So it was the first one that kind of popularized that kind of idea of convention over configuration. Okay, right. Why you're at a JavaScript meetup? Why the hell do you care about Ruby on Rails? Okay, I'm not here just to evangelize Ruby or anything like that. Don't worry. A couple of reasons. One is, as a professional software engineer, you're going to run into Ruby on Rails almost inevitably in the course of what you do. Now, you all use a product that's built on Ruby on Rails. You all use GitHub, probably. it's quite likely that at some point, if you're developing, even just working on a client-side application, there's going to be an API involved in that, and a huge number of APIs. What a lot of companies ended up sort of moving towards was a situation where you had a JavaScript front end and Ruby or Rails on the back end. So that's a very kind of common situation. So you might find yourself in an environment where there's a Rails API in the back end. And then the other thing that might happen is you might end up being asked to work on what you might call a monolithic Rails application. So that's where everything is bundled together, front and back end code, all of the views, all of the HTML, all of the JavaScript, all in one application. So having a sort of passing familiarity with Rails will obviously stand you in good stead. And well, if you're like, no, don't care about any of that. Rails was pretty influential. It still is, I would say. So there's a kind of we used to talk about the Rails way of doing things. So there's potentially some things to learn there. And if you're just kind of getting out and learning software engineering, software development, you're just getting started, then sometimes it kind of helps to have a bit of context as to how things work. Where did we get? Well, how did we get to where we got to? What led up to all of this stuff? To kind of help you kind of get some perspective. So that's why you should care. Hopefully, I've answered that enough. I will focus on, obviously, JavaScript within Ruby on Rails, though. So I'm going to start at the beginning in terms of where Rails came out of. So at the time, there was an awful lot of chat about this brand new thing called Web 2.0. Now I know we're on Web 3.0, and I'll get to that in a second. But Web 2.0 was the big thing, was the big buzzword. And there were curmudgeons who said that it's just a buzzword, it's just a lot of nonsense. And then there was the other people who said, no, there's something really cool and different about this. Kind of annoyingly, I think now when we're talking about Web 2, it's because we're sort of going back and retrospectively changing our definitions for what Web 2 is now, because we've got this new Web 3 thing that we've decided is Web 3 is decentralized, so Web 2 means centralized on social media and Facebook. But at least for someone who was kind of got into software engineering at the time, that isn't what Web 2 was about at all. So if you think about a bigger problem, if you want to write an application, business application, whatever, and you want to get it into loads of people's hands, how do you write it in a way that you can do that cross-platform and in a scalable way? Do you write a desktop application? There wasn't mobile, didn't really exist as a platform so much then. So how do you do that? So you probably put something on the web. Generally we didn't really talk so much about web applications at the time. We talked about websites and adding interactivity into websites. So how would you do that? You probably do it server side, and you probably worked in one of three ecosystems, more likely than not. You probably were in the big enterprisey Sun, Oracle, Java ecosystem, and if you were doing that, then you would probably at this point in history would have probably turned to Spring. You might have existed in the Microsoft ecosystem, so you would have been using IIS was the web server, and you're probably using ASP.NET on the server side. Or you were in the open source Linux ecosystem, and in which case your web server was almost certainly going to be Apache, and that was by far and away the most popular web server on the internet. And if you wanted to do something interactive, you wanted to write a program that interacted with a web request, then you would probably turn to something called a CGI bin script. CGI stands for Common Gateway Interface. I'm not going to really go into this, but essentially what would happen is Apache would take the web request, hand over the web request to an external program. The external program would just spit something out, and it would just pass that back over to the web browser. Great, simple kind of solution to the problem. It was horrifically insecure, horrifically slow, had lots and lots of problems. If you ever were doing web development at the point where you had to set up CGI bin scripts, you probably don't remember that very fondly. Partly because of the horrendous performance issues, some bright sparks decided to write some CGI scripts in C. Can you imagine from the security point of view? And that eventually evolved into PHP. This whole thing at this point, from a security point of view, was an utter disaster, and there was so many issues with web worms that actually spread around through CGI scripts and all the rest of it. But this was the state of the art. Around the 2000s, you may have started using PHP. And again, if you were using, if you're in the Microsoft ecosystem, you're probably using ASP.NET. OK, but what if you wanted client-side functionality? You wanted something that was interactive, that's actually running locally and was super responsive. How would you do that? So you probably one of three things. You probably use Flash, you probably use Java applets, or you probably use ActiveX. And all of these things were essentially programs that were running within the browser, didn't really interact with the rest of the, what was going on the web page. Essentially, apps that were downloaded onto the internet and just happened to run through the web browser. And all these things were pretty horrific as well. But in particular, why was it horrific? Because you had to get license fees to get this stuff if you want to develop on it, or it was just horrifically complex. I mean, if you wanted to develop a Java applet, that wasn't an accessible route to doing anything. JavaScript was obviously invented to do interactive stuff in the browser, but at the time, there was horrendous cross-browser issues. You wrote something in Internet Explorer, it wouldn't run in Mozilla. So we had all of these Netscape Navigator. Sorry, that's what I was thinking of. So yeah, lots of problems with JavaScript. However, Microsoft did do one incredibly awesome thing. They had some functions that it was originally part of ActiveX, and you could hook into with JavaScript that would allow you to do this really clever thing. You'd allow you to transfer data in the background in the web browser asynchronously. And does anyone know what we start to call that? Ajax, exactly, yes, which is for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So Internet Explorer built in this API. You could interact with it with JavaScript. Some of the other web browsers thought, this is awesome, we're going to implement this as well. And that was the thing that unlocked Web 2.0. And suddenly you could do incredible stuff. And that's when we started to see things like Google Maps and Gmail and webmail clients that could do crazy stuff. That was the absolute paradigm shift, being able to, with accessible technology, be able to do stuff client-side that sent data asynchronously, and it just unlocked a huge amount of stuff. That was Web 2.0. And that was incredibly exciting because you didn't, yeah, sure, this stuff kind of existed, but now the average developer could actually start doing some crazy stuff. So this is what Rails was all about at the beginning. Now, I mentioned Web 2.0. Web 2.0 was definitely, some people thought it was this is a buzzword. I was not one of the curmudgeons. I was one of the people who were like, absolutely, I think this is the next wave of what the web is going to be all about. Web 3, this isn't a joke slide. This is literally what I think about it. But I guess that's just, I've just been in the game that long. So maybe I'm just a curmudgeon now. I'm not sure. So I'm just going to show you a quick timeline here because I think it's quite interesting when you actually kind of lay it out in terms of the years. Because you see, PHP came out, mid-90s, although it wasn't as huge as it is until sort of the late 90s and 2000s. And you probably heard of something called the LAMP stack, which was Linux, Apache, PHP, and MySQL, which was used pretty heavily even at the time that Ruby on Rails came out. But the point that Ruby on Rails was released, it packaged a bunch of stuff all together that made web development so much easier and so much faster. There was a JavaScript library that was actually extracted from Ruby on Rails, so it wouldn't have existed without Ruby on Rails, called prototype.js. And it was kind of one of the early competitors to jQuery. Now nobody uses it. It kind of lost out in the framework wars. But what was quite interesting is the point that Ruby on Rails was released, so there's sort of explosion in server-side web frameworks. Up until that point, if you were developing something, especially developing something in PHP, there wasn't a particular approach to developing a web application. Everyone did things in a slightly different way. What Ruby on Rails gives you was not just a set of libraries, but an approach to actually developing applications and an easy way to do Ajax and to do that work with JavaScript. And that was brand new. At the same time, you were starting to see the first sort of client-side libraries were coming out. But the client-side libraries were kind of where PHP was like years earlier, in that there wasn't a specific approach to actually developing applications. There wasn't,
this sort of convention over configuration. And arguably, sort of Michael sort of said this still isn't in a way. But you can see kind of a few years down the line after Node.js was released, then there was this explosion on the client side, taking up this kind of idea of MVC frameworks and all the rest of it. And I don't know very many people. Does anyone remember Backbone.js? Yeah. So I think that was the first one that really, on the client side, in terms of JavaScript, was the first MVC framework. I might be wrong about that. But then after JavaScript, then there was this huge explosion. Ember, Meteor, React, Vue, Polymer, Angular. I mean, it was literally every single year there was this brand new, shiny JavaScript framework. But there was this delay when we were still doing JavaScript in this kind of way that we were doing back-end development, where we didn't have a structure, we didn't have an approach for doing it. So I don't know what the lesson is there, but I kind of thought it was quite interesting that there was this sort of delay between how this sort of best practice kind of moved from the back end to the front end. Now Rails actually, so people kind of see it as almost a competitor to doing stuff on the client side, but actually Rails in its early days tried to make it as easy as possible to do JavaScript. Now, some people will not remember this fondly, but one of the early things that Rails did to make it as easy as possible was actually to help you write JavaScript without touching JavaScript whatsoever. Had this thing called RJS, which stands for Ruby JavaScript, where there was a domain-specific language written in Ruby that would generate JavaScript from a bunch of Ruby functions, so you didn't actually have to know any JavaScript at all. And what that would do is inject inline HTML and JavaScript into your views, into your templates, that would know how to interact with the back-end Rails framework. And it worked, and it made it super, super easy to do basic Ajax all the way back in 2004, and people did. Now, one of the issues with this is the JavaScript that it generated was based on the library prototype.js, so it was very tightly kind of linked with that framework. And around sort of 2005, 2006, people started using jQuery. They didn't want to use prototype.js anymore. Now, I feel that I'm going way, way back here, and this is like 15 years ago, but there are places I hear of that still use RJS, or they certainly use techniques like RJS in their Rails applications. So hopefully you will never in your professional career run across a Rails 1.0 application that someone's asking you to do any work on, although it's not completely unfathomable. But it's possible that they might still be using RJS as a library, which was extracted out of the Rails framework, and they might still be doing something in this kind of way. So that was the initial approach. I'm just going to touch on Rails 2.0 in 2007 because one of the things that Rails did at the time, it sort of prompted this explosion of other web frameworks, not just outside of Ruby, but also within Ruby, the Ruby language as well. One that was, I don't know how much is used anymore, but at the time was quite ahead of the curve, was Sinatra. And this is a Sinatra app. This is you essentially spinning up a web server and providing a response to a web browser, literally 4 lines of code. And this kind of stuff now, we're just like, oh, yeah, whatever, blah, blah, blah. We do this kind of stuff all the time. But again, in a context of like web development being really complicated, requiring a lot of expertise, a lot of coding, this was just so ahead of its game. So people were doing all sorts of crazy stuff in terms of making API development and web development as easy as possible. A lot of people started using Sinatra for developing APIs, particular JSON APIs that sat behind a front-end application. And Rails started to link in with the kind of underlying libraries that Sinatra and some of these other frameworks were using. So in 2010, Rails decoupled the framework, the web framework, from prototype.js and implemented something called unobtrusive JavaScript. So now if you use the Ruby functions to generate something in your templates, rather than generating inline JavaScript, what it would do is essentially just add these data tags, data attributes to your tags. And then there was a JavaScript library that was loaded that wasn't dependent on any particular JavaScript bigger library like jQuery or prototype.js, and that would attach some behavior to these links. And that was pretty good, kind of practice back in 2010. It meant that you didn't have to use prototype.js anymore. But at the time, so some of the stuff, one of the things I was going to mention is, up until this point, probably Rails was the framework that was probably leading a lot of innovation. One of the issues with Rails was the way it was implemented was still kind of in this sort of, in some cases, in this CGI bin type way, in which you'd run a Rails application that would take a web request from Apache and then would do something with it. If you wanted to, if you're running a website that needed like 4 or 5 concurrent web requests coming in all at once, you needed to spin up 4 Rails application servers. Rails wasn't fully thread safe, so it wasn't great. And Node.js, one of the kind of main reasons for people kind of developing Node.js was being able to develop stuff with like a huge amount of concurrency. So we're starting to do this incredible stuff with the web now. What if I want to write a chat room on the web and I want 1,000 people to be able to connect to this room and talk to each other in real time? How do I do that? You wouldn't be able to do that on Rails because you wouldn't be able to spin up 1,000 Rails servers. That wouldn't be realistic. So Node.js had kind of come on the scene. And I'll get to it a bit later on, but then Rails, some of the things in Rails started to become sort of a response to the innovation that was happening elsewhere. Rails 3.1, we decided that, jQuery was the default library now, that's not such a big deal. But one of the things was that up until this point in a Rails application, if you had any JavaScript or CSS, it would essentially be served as static assets, so just the same as an image. There was nothing special about a JavaScript file or a CSS file. So in Rails 3.1, integrated something called sprockets. We call it the asset pipeline, and it meant that you could do things with the JavaScript and the CSS in your project, like run it through a preprocessor. So at the time, I think this was before things like HTTP2 pipelining and stuff like this. If someone hit your website and there was you needed like 30, 40 requests to load the full page, all of the image assets, all of the CSS, all of the JavaScript, the browser at the time couldn't really cope with that very well. So one thing that people started to do was to combine all of their JavaScript into a single file, combine all the CSS into a single file, strip out all of the white space in it, rename the variables to single letter variables, everything possible to squeeze out as much performance as possible. And then in some cases, people were hitting up against the limitations of CSS, so they wanted to use things like Sass and other kind of preprocessors in order to be able to write better CSS. And in the case of JavaScript, and some people still hated JavaScript that much that they wanted to use stuff like CoffeeScript and other preprocessors for JavaScript, so they didn't have to write as much JavaScript. So the asset pipeline would take your JavaScript, run it through whichever preprocessor you wanted to, concatenate everything, make sure it was timestamped, so if you made a change, the web browser would reload it properly. Again, pretty kind of ahead of its time kind of stuff, but this is where things then started to go. Well, okay, now I'm going to talk about turbo links, and then things start to go a bit weird. So for a lot of people, and it's kind of weird when I look back on this to a certain extent, is I can't remember when Twitter came out with a single page app. Does anyone remember when that was off the top of their heads? So Twitter used to be dead simple, static HTML. They had constant scalability issues, scaling issues, and all the rest of it. But there was a point, and it was around about this time, that they decided that if you hit the Twitter homepage, it would load some JavaScript, and then that JavaScript would load all of the HTML asynchronously. And it pretty much probably procedurally generated all of the HTML. And the performance was horrendous. It was absolutely awful. But the weird thing is, the client-side stuff, one of the reasons that, if you didn't actually need, sortable lists and that kind of interaction, the reason that you were doing that was performance, because every time you clicked a link, the entire page needed to be reloaded. In Rails, when we were kind of looking at this, rather than so the kind of innovation there was to kind of think, well, what's really the problem that a lot of people want to solve? And it's just that kind of faster response time, more kind of responsive web application. So what TurboLinks gave you was an ability, if someone clicked a hyperlink, rather than the entire page being reloaded, just the contents of the body within the 2 body tags would be sent over from the server, already pre-rendered. It would update the page title and the URL as well, which was a big thing at the time. Push state had just come out as an API and would be updated in the address bar. So before, if you did something with Ajax, one of the issues was the URL and the page wouldn't change. So if you tried to use the browser's back and forward button, then you would end up leaving the application entirely. The way that Twitter got around that was using, and you don't really see it anymore, thank God, but they were the ones that started using it. It was the sort of the hash bang, so it was a hash and then an exclamation mark and then the rest of the URL. And the web browser just interpreted that as a page fragment, so they didn't care about it, but it made sure that the back button still worked and you could still pick up the full URL in the JavaScript. And I think that's how Backbone originally did some of its MVC stuff. But push state was it was an API that allowed you to actually change what was showing in the URL bar. And so with TurboLinks, you were basically able to get a lot of the responsiveness of a single page application, but do it without writing any JavaScript. In Rails 5, due to all of the things around concurrency, Rails 5 brought out some integration with WebSockets to allow you to implement a pub sub model, so a publish subscriber kind of model. So you would create a channel that you want to send messages to. People would subscribe to that channel, and as in within an API that would allow you to distribute a message to, rather than just to 1 or 2 clients, to thousands of clients that are all connected at the same time. But the thing is, at this point, Node had been out for quite some time. And if you were doing development in this kind of area, you would probably have already gone to Node at this point, or to one of the other kind of frameworks. So this is not really innovation anymore, because this is kind of response to stuff that was happening elsewhere. But Rails did implement it kind of slightly belatedly. So this is when I think things started to go a bit kind of wonky. So we already had a tool for managing assets, so JavaScript, CSS, and image assets, running them through preprocessors and doing all of this kind of stuff. So Webpack exists as a JavaScript library. So Webpacker was a Rails, it was a Ruby implementation of Webpack. And essentially did all of the same things that Sprockets did, but just specifically did it for JavaScript and did it using the JavaScript Webpack library. So one of the things, and then also integrated Yarn as well. So if your Rails application had JavaScript dependencies, how are you going to manage that? Did you bundle the JavaScript dependencies in your application? How did you manage the versioning? How did you do all of that? Well, if you worked in the Node ecosystem, then you would be using Yarn, and this is how you would be doing things. So Rails kind of implemented that within Rails applications. You had this horrible duplication of functionality, and if you were just getting started out in Rails, and you didn't know anything about JavaScript, suddenly you needed to install Node, and suddenly you needed to understand all of this other stuff that was really kind of irrelevant to getting up and running on Ruby on Rails, at least in my opinion. In Rails 6, it was now made Webpacker the default compiler. So you had no choice but to kind of use it in a new application. So anyway, I know that's like a ridiculous kind of, I've covered a lot of ground there. If you run into a Rails application, there's possibility that you're going to run into any one of these things in this sort of life cycle. But one of the things I also just wanted to illustrate is that, although in the middle there and along all of this chat was Rails is dead and all the rest of it, and people moved over to JavaScript, at the beginning point when Rails came out, it was super ahead of the curve, and it actually progressed and prompted a lot of innovation within JavaScript and a lot of the innovation that happened with a lot of the web frameworks at the time. So I don't really think that there's kind of these things aren't quite as competitive, I think. They were a bit more symbiotic in the early days. And I think one of the things now with Rails is we're kind of, I feel, going back to that a little bit. So Rails 7 has been a huge breath of fresh air because they stripped out all of the Webpacker stuff. It's not included by default anymore. You don't have to use it. You can if you want to, if you're doing something that's really kind of heavy in terms of JavaScript and you're using React and all the rest of it. But if you're just starting out in web development and you want to get do some sort of best practice in terms of JavaScript as well, it includes something called Hotwire. So Hotwire is a collection of libraries, one of which is Turbo, which is essentially just turbo links, which we've already talked about. So if you want to do basic Ajax in the sense of you want to have a responsive web application that is doing server-side rendering, so sending HTML over the wire, which is something now that people kind of talk about in a weird way as a brand new innovation, but it's just used to be the way that we did things. But if that's what you want, then that's what that gives you. And then Stimulus, which is a lightweight JavaScript library, which is a wee bit similar to Vue and to some other things, where you're within your templates, and you can have this completely separate if you want, in terms of doing components, which is kind of the direction that kind of Michael was kind of showing. But you can embed this piece of HTML anywhere in your normal Rails templates, and you set up a controller here, and you attach some behavior to that controller, and Rails by default now kind of gives you this. I think we've got to a point now where we don't need the JavaScript preprocessors like CoffeeScript and stuff like that, because in the intervening years, JavaScript has improved considerably in terms of the syntax, in terms of what you're able to do with it. And most people now need faster, more responsive apps, and they need some interactivity. So, you know, if you're looking for something where you've got a library that's going to give you that kind of basic kind of starting out, then actually you might have thought Rails. I know I'm starting to sound like an evangelist now, and this wasn't really what the talk was about. But if you're starting out, then not to look at Rails as a competitor to Vue and React and all of these other things is actually a really kind of lightweight way, actually, if you get in some of the benefit of the best practice in JavaScript right now, and to write some lightweight functionality components in JavaScript, and to get you started. And that's it. I think that's my talk. So I don't know how coherent that was, but there you go. Anyone have any questions? I don't even have a question slide. Look at that. I got to that last one and I thought I'm done now with this.
You're basically saying thanks to Rails, thanks to Ruby.
Thanks to Ruby. What's that?
You're basically saying thanks to Ruby, the world currently exists as we know it.
Yeah, I suppose there's a little part of me which is like I'm a wee bit sad because everyone kind of moves on to new stuff. I think one of the things I probably didn't get across very well is that if you've been doing web development for any length of time, and it's just a way of things, but you kind of see this sort of fluctuation between different approaches. So the client side and the server side one is really the classic one. You know, way back in the day, like in the 80s, it was thin client, everything was running on the server. And then there was a point, early 90s, where it was everything runs on the desktop and the servers are just kind of doing coordination. And then when we came to the web, well, the only way to do it was actually to do everything on the server because the client side didn't have any functionality. And then we decided, well, actually, we want these full-featured applications that run in the web browser. And then we realized, well, a lot of people's computers are pretty slow and the web browsers aren't running super fast. So actually, we could be taking advantage of all of the power of compute power that's in the cloud. So why not do things like render the HTML in the cloud before you send it to the web browser? And we kind of fluctuate between all of these things. And it's a wee bit frustrating to see sometimes, because sometimes I think we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Same thing happened with XML. People got sick of XML, totally sick of XML. And reasonably so, because they were using it, trying to use it, shoehorn it into everything, like MathML, like everything. For every problem, we're going to generate XML. Why are you making your face? What are you making face?
It always descends into the XML conversation.
Oh, right, okay. So, and so people naturally came out with JSON, which coincidentally, obviously, well, not coincidentally, but obviously was better in some respects because it fit with the JavaScript model better. But JSON doesn't have a huge amount of the tooling that XML does. We don't have JSON style sheets still, really. People were doing a lot of procedural generation of stuff where we had a functional language that existed in XML, and we threw all of that stuff out. So I find that sometimes it's good to kind of look back on how things have evolved, because then sometimes when the next thing comes along, you think, actually, it's not just this brand new wave of innovation. We're probably going to go back to what we were doing 5 years ago, again, just in a different way. So anyway. Rails.
Does anybody have any more questions for Alan? Cool. Well, thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you.
Cool. I'm going
right,
to switch with you.
Awkward switch over.
Cool. Thank you. Right. Cool. So thank you to both Michael and Alan. We will be back next month. We haven't quite decided on the date yet because we're figuring out room bookings. It will either be on the 19th or 26th, or either be me or Alan hosting, depending on which one of those dates it is. We are still looking for speakers, so if you're interested in speaking, it can be a talk about the history of web development, a talk about a particular technical topic, or maybe something like where you're like, this is who I am and what I do, and this is the stack that I use. Because I think it's quite interesting seeing what people really use like day to day, and like kind of you can take all the best practice in the web, but sometimes you just need to be like, this is how I name my files, and this is the problems that I've encountered, on these sorts of projects. So anything like that would be really good. If you DM us on Twitter, EdinburghJS, or me, I'm Jamie McHale on Twitter, send us a DM or fill out a pull request or issue request on the website now. I figured I'd let people do that. So set that up today for anybody that wants to do those sort of things. So thank you for attending. There's probably a little bit of pizza and beer left, and we will wrap it up there. Thank you.